One of the most frustrating things about translating is that there are certain words, phrases, and concepts that are simply impossible to translate or untranslatable. There's this classic moment in the 4th chapter of Dream of the Red Chamber where Lin Daiyu and Zhao Baoyu first lay eyes on each other. So here in the classic 1987 television version, the electricity between the two characters is obvious. It's almost like you could reach out and touch the magnetism. But even that Hollywood-style flair can't come close to capturing the magic of the original text. I know that that's an old trope, right? The book is always better than the movie, or in this case, the television show. But the problem here has to do with the description itself. Not only is it impossible to film this description, but it's also honestly impossible to translate, and I'll show you why. The problem lies in this poem at the end of the passage where Zhao Baoyu first sees Lin Daiyu, and there are two issues here. As is common in classic Chinese novels, Zhao Baoyu's infatuation with Lin Daiyu is described in poetic format. Now, the first and obvious problem lies in the final sentence of this poem. Lin Daiyu is referred to as more perceptive than Bi Gan and 3 times as sickly as Shi Shi. Don't you love it when Chinese authors make references to Chinese history that the rest of us know little to nothing about? Fortunately, though, this one's pretty easy to explain, even though it technically is untranslatable. After all, you can always use a few lines to teach your reader about history in your translation. We'll start with this guy Bi Gan, who was a prominent figure during the Shang dynasty, and yes, he's a man, not a woman. Bi Gan was worshipped for a little while as the god of wealth. However, Bi Gan was also well known for his loyalty and was remembered as an exemplar of the loyal advisor willing to lose his life for speaking the truth. The original poem in Dream of the Red Chamber says that Lin Daiyu had one more hole in her heart than Bi Gan, who famously had 7 holes in his heart, representing his extraordinary wisdom and insight. And yeah, that's kind of disgusting, and it isn't really all that obvious. You've got to remember that this is a Chinese legend that went on for several centuries, and it got caught up in all the Buddhist and Taoist thought. Anyway, the important thing for the reader to know is that Cao Shuiqin is basically saying that Lin Daiyu was incredibly perceptive and wise, which itself is easy enough to translate. But then we get to the part about Shi Shi, which is even stranger. Here at the end, it literally says that Lin Daiyu was 3 times more sickly than Shi Shi. Shi Shi, of course, is famous as one of the 4 beauties of ancient China, which is particularly significant, especially if, you're a guy like me. Of course, representations of Shi Shi differ based on what the artists consider beautiful. For example, I'm not so sure that I agree with this one. Now, this is a little bit more like it. Anyway, depictions of Shi Shi always have her carrying a basket of silk that she washes by the river, because this is how she was originally discovered by the government of her kingdom of Yue. Her fabulous beauty made her irresistible to the king of Wu in an espionage campaign that led to the fall of that kingdom of Wu. There's this old classical story that uses a phrase that goes something like this: "Yi gu qing ren cheng, zai gu qing ren guo." So one look topples the men of the city, and another look topples the men of the country. That eventually turned into a phrase called "qing cheng qing guo," which describes a woman that is so beautiful that she could overthrow a country. And as you can imagine, there's this total sexist tone to all of this, as if a beautiful woman were worth nothing more than being used as a political Trojan horse. Anyway, Shi Shi's beauty is an old Chinese trope for sure. But the problem is that the text here refers to her sickness, not her beauty. And while it's obvious that Lin Daiyu is extremely attractive, you'll notice that Cao Shuiqin doesn't really take a lot of time or energy to describe precisely what she looks like. Her character and her inner feelings are described far more vividly than her outward appearance. And as you already know, that totally breaks the trope. Now, think about it this way. Imagine that you're writing a romance book, but you never talk about how luscious her lips are. You never talk about, how perfectly manicured her fingers are or whatever, right? Nobody would read it, right? But the real bizarre part is that the reference to Lin Daiyu being more sickly than Shi Shi is kind of a compliment, right? And yes, it is indeed intended to be a compliment for her. I'll show you. Like almost all the stuff in classical Chinese literature that doesn't make any sense, this is a direct reference to philosophic writings. In particular, this refers to the writing of Zhuangzi, a Taoist philosopher from around the 4th century BC. Anyway, the one reference to Shishu being sick comes from this passage in the Zhuangzi about an ugly woman from the village seeing her and trying to imitate her. That passage itself is the story behind the idiom Dongshi Xiaopin. This is the story of an ugly woman who thought she'd become beautiful by imitating the way that Shishu walked. Shishu was heartbroken and walked around clutching her chest and frowning, and so the ugly woman did the same thing. The moral here is that Dongshi knew that Shishu's frown was beautiful but didn't understand why. But the thing is that Cao Shuiqin is not saying that Lin Dayu was like Dongshi, not at all. Actually, this is a reference to Lin Dayu being even more heartbroken than Shishu. And if you think about it, Cao Shuiqin is directly saying that Lin Dayu was even more beautiful than Shishu, because Shishu's beauty, according to that story, comes from the fact that she was legitimately heartbroken. The key here can only be seen in the Chinese passage from Zhuangzi, where Shishu is specifically described as bingxin, or sick in her heart. Now, if you look at this rather poor translation in Wiktionary, you'll see that bingxin is translated as having heart disease, which makes me suspect that this was actually translated by AI. Shishu's beauty was caused by the sadness and the pain that she felt in her heart as she was forced to abandon the world that she knew in order to work as a spy for her state. And Lin Dayu's beauty and melancholy come not from her sickness, but from the fact that she had to abandon the life that she knew and her own family for a shot at Zhao Baoyu. You've got to remember that Lin Dayu goes to the Zhao family largely because her best chance at living a comfortable life is to become betrothed to and eventually married to Zhao Baoyu. Of course, to do so, she has to compete with Shui Baochai, and the friendship and rivalry between the two girls is the stuff of legend. Now, deeply embedded within all of this is a very frank criticism of the social system of China at the time. In other words, you cannot read Dream of the Red Chamber and not feel sorrow and regret for Lin Dayu. She was a literary genius who had to face tragedy and heartache for her whole life due to no fault of her own. That is how she's like Shishu. Anyway, a little bit of digging helps clear up that part of the poem, right? Now, in his famous translation of the book called The Story of the Stone, David Hawkes translates these two allusions literally. But what in the world does it mean to have more chambers in her heart than Bigan? And what does it mean to suffer a tithe more pain than Shishu? I mean, the allusions kind of get there if you know the history, but they don't go all the way. And the problem with that David Hawkes translation is that he never gives us any footnotes to tell us what in the world is going on. I do think the Dream of the Red Chamber is to an extent self-explanatory, but it is really hard for scholars to create meaningful commentary in English if they don't know what these literary allusions actually refer to. In their less well-known translation, A Dream of Red Mansions, Gladys Yang and her husband Yang Xianyi did a worse job than David Hawkes, at least in my opinion. The Yangs referred to Lin Dayu being more sensitive than Bigan and more delicate than Shishu, which seems to me to be a deliberate mistranslation. There are some footnotes which kind of helps, but the actual meaning of these literary allusions are still lost. And it's possible that these translators also did not fully understand what Cao Shuiqin was talking about. I mean, it's not that Zhuangzi is obscure or anything like that, so I mean, I kind of get it. But the thing is that these allusions are talking about untranslatable concepts. They're untranslatable in the sense that you can't find a single good English word to describe them. Now, I get this concept of something being untranslatable from this philosophic book called The Dictionary of Untranslatables, which was published in English a little over a decade ago. Like all good abstract books of little general interest, the original was actually written and published in French. Anyway, this book explains numerous abstract concepts that have largely shaped the modern Western world, things that are really hard to translate, like common sense. You've also got really loaded concepts such as the German concept of Dasein, which is kind of like existence, kind of like life, and kind of like a headache if you're trying to translate it. And then, of course, you've got page after page on what I consider to be the most loaded concept of all, logos. Now, I'll be honest with you, I am no Greek scholar. I can read Greek words, but I do a pretty poor job of trying to tell you about the grammar. I tried to study modern Greek on my own a couple of years ago, 4 years ago or so, and I've been taking a hiatus ever since. And I'm certainly not a New Testament scholar. In fact, I'm really not religious. But the thing is, this concept of logos is one of those loaded concepts that brings with it a lot of literary baggage. It's similar to that talk that we just had about Shishir, and I'll show you why. So as many of you know, logos is famous for its reference in the New Testament, and I'm going to use a clipping from the reliable Nestle Aland version of the Greek. The controversy comes from the first chapter of the Gospel according to John, where that untranslatable word logos is used 3 times. Of course, any literary geek worth his pocket protector thinks right away of the reference to this verse in the first part of Goethe's Faust. In search of true inspiration and revelation, Faust decides to open up his New Testament to translate it into his beloved German. But he knows that the famous Greek phrase, en arche en ho logos, cannot simply mean in the beginning was the word. Perhaps instead it is in the beginning was the meaning, but meaning or sense itself can't create the world, can it? So maybe it means in the beginning was the power, or better yet, in the beginning was the deed. So unfortunately, poor Faust is never able to figure it out, and he decides to do one of those you only live once adventures and makes that deal with the devil. His problem, of course, is that he ran into this untranslatable concept, where using one word means getting rid of all of the other possible meanings. And if you spend only a few minutes reading theology, you will know that the religious world is filled with problems just like this one. Maybe we should all sell our souls to the devil like Faust. Anyway, the crazy thing is that the same problem exists in Dream of the Red Chamber. In fact, it's right under our nose in the passage that we just read, but I didn't point it out, that's all. At the beginning of the poem describing how Jiabaoyu sees Lin Dayu, he sees that her eyes are filled with something called Qing. This character is arguably the most important character in all of Dream of the Red Chamber, and it is a word that is simply impossible to adequately translate. Faust would surely have had a field day if he knew about how varied and complex the definitions of Qing are. Were Lin Dayu's eyes filled with sentiment? Were they filled with love and affection? Were they filled with amorous passion? Were they filled with reason? You see, the problem with words is that the words mean something, and sometimes a single word can mean a host of different things depending on the context. So when you're dealing with an unapologetically literary work like Dream of the Red Chamber, you're bound to run into situations where you have to interpret what is going on for the reader of your translation. And the more that you know about the literary context, the better off you are. Now, the historical background behind the use of the term Qing in Dream of the Red Chamber goes back to something called the Revivalist movement in the late 15th and very early 16th centuries in China. This movement was very much about rejecting the formality of the rigid scholarship of the time and revitalizing ancient poetic traditions. The movement was also closely tied with the famous Hanlin Academy. Now, the focus of this revivalist movement was on the expression of Qing, translated here in the Cambridge History of Chinese Literature as emotion. The thing is, though, that this is not just emotion. It's feeling, but it's not just any feeling, right? This is that feeling of pure energy that you get from wonderful poetry. So think about that movie, The Dead Poets Society, Oh Captain, My Captain, and on and on. That's what we're talking about here. That is the feeling that Qing describes. And that Oh Captain, My Captain sense, that's the thing that fills Lin Dayu's eyes. And so when Jiabaoyu sees that Lin Dayu's eyes are filled with Qing, it's almost like he sees them filled with poetry or filled with life. The Yangs therefore call her eyes speaking eyes, though I don't think that fully captures the feeling. David Hawkes, meanwhile, calls them passionate eyes, which really upsets me because Qing really means more than just sexual lust. And even my own translation of eyes with a dreamy sweetness doesn't really do the concept of Qing any justice. And that's why it's untranslatable. So what do you do with an untranslatable concept like this? Well, you tell your audience why you can't translate it, for example, in a video, and you try to get the discussion started. And that's precisely what my translation of this book does. Now, the best way to deal with an impossible to translate passage is to tell everybody why it's so hard to translate. After all, the real joy in reading these old and obscure texts is figuring out these wild and elusive insights into the very nature of human beings. And that's the sort of thing that no garbage tier AI slop translation will ever give you. Anyway, go check out the project and let me know what you think. Check it out for yourself. The link to the blog, as always, is in the description. And remember, Dream of the Red Chamber was written by a human being and was intended to be read by other human beings. So do not trust AI garbage slop with something as important as literary translation.